My encounters with this Wendigo creature lasted all throughout high school, and it all started when I was just a freshman in high school. It was near the end of the year, around April or May, and I had gone to a friend's house party. For whatever reason, my close friend at the time decided to have a seance because he believed his house was haunted by his great aunt who had just passed a year prior. I guess he had been having some paranormal things go on in his house and wanted to contact her and speak to her himself. I joined in on the seance, and nothing really exciting happened, at least that I can recall. But after that, it changed everything for me. I live about 20 minutes away, and so while I can't say distance was a deciding factor in my experiences, I can probably say whatever we experienced at that seance, even though I never felt or heard anything, must have followed me back home, because it was the summer between freshman year of high school and sophomore year that things really kicked off into high gear. It primarily started off with horrendous nightmares, always being chased by this tall black figure with a skeletal-like face and large antlers and horns. It was terrifying, and it was this reoccurring nightmare, the same thing, almost several nights a week, all throughout the summer. I would be walking in the woods on this trail, and this thing would come out of the woods and start barreling towards me, running on all fours, and then, as it would get closer, it would stand up on two legs and reach out to grab me, and every time, I would severely lose speed, turn around, and just as this thing would be about to be grabbing me, I would wake up. This happened constantly, the same nightmare over and over. Once fall kicked in, about September, because I had just begun my sophomore year, I started having sightings of this thing. At first, it would just start off as a typical paranormal thing. You know, seeing shapes and movement out of the corner of your eye in your house. But one night, it was before Halloween, I was staying up late, studying for a math exam, and I saw something outside my window in our yard, moving closer to the house. When I looked out, I thought it was a burglar, or somebody trying to break into our house. But as I sat there and watched, I noticed this figure did not look human as I once thought it was, and on its head, to my horror, were the same horns and antler shapes, just like it appeared in my dream. The figure was jet black, very lanky, kind of like they talk about with Slender Man, but this wasn't a Slender Man. I'm just using that as a reference to explain how long its limbs were, the legs and forearms especially, and its body was kind of slim and gaunt. It moved with much guile, and like it was some sort of secret agent trying not to be caught. I was terrified, but my parents weren't home this night. I can't remember where they were out at, so I rushed into the kitchen, grabbed the largest knife I could find, and hid back in my bedroom, making sure all the house doors were locked and nothing could get in. I looked back out my window, and I could not see it anywhere, but I could just feel this awful presence looming all around the outside of the house. It did not feel welcoming at all. I pretty much stayed up the rest of the night, and yeah, I couldn't really focus on my math exam that I was supposed to be studying for. Instead, I felt like it was far more important trying to stay alive. I fell asleep sometime in the early morning. I woke up. Everything seemed fine. Fast forward to around Christmas time, maybe a week before, and I remember coming downstairs and seeing my dad, panicked, on the phone, continuously looking out the back window. When he began talking, I realized he was on the phone with 911 and was telling the operator about how he thinks he saw somebody coming up to the house, ready to break in. When he got off the phone, I began asking him what's going on, and he points out back to where we have a large bush, thinking he saw somebody coming up to the house, someone who was very large and in all black. Immediately, panic set in, and the memories of summer and what I saw back in the fall came rushing in. But I never told my father this. Within 5 minutes, an officer showed up. My father spoke with him, and he began thoroughly investigating all around our house, both sides and behind. Of course, like in every story, including ours, he never found a thing and told us to always call again in case something happens. Well, the night went on as usual. Christmas came and went. The first of the year came and went. Now come January, and things really kick up. One night, I was sound asleep when I woke up in the middle of the night to go use the bathroom and get some water. I did that, and as I'm coming back to my room, I quickly laid back down in bed and got ready to fall back asleep. Right as I was in that in-between stage of sleep and awake, I heard something kind of tapping very lightly on my window. It kept doing it 3, 4, maybe 5 or 6 times, enough to keep me from falling asleep. Thinking it was maybe a tree or a branch hitting my window or my side wall, I got up and opened up my blinds, and I screamed and fell back. It was this long, black, clawed hand pressing against the glass of my window, very lightly tapping with the claws. I flew out of bed, ran to my parents' room, and was so overcome with fear that I didn't even care. I looked like a scared toddler running to Mommy and Daddy's room. I burst through my parents' door, screaming, telling them there's something outside my window, and it's trying to get in. Both my parents rush up, go out, look, and they don't see anything. My father calls the police again. They come by, they take my statement, they take my parents' statement, they do a thorough search. They don't find anything except one thing. They find these large tracks leading from the back of the yard all the way up to my window, and it was snowing, so they were starting to get filled in. The police officer said whoever it was suspected to be a very large man. In a way, though, it did feel validating, knowing I wasn't entirely crazy, but also terrifying, knowing that what I was experiencing was more than real. Valentine's Day came and went, and we get to about the very beginning of March, and I start to see more of this thing. I was walking back home from a friend's house later at night, probably not too late, maybe 7:30, 8 p.m. It had just gotten dark, and daylight savings time had just happened. I was walking home on a lone neighborhood road. It wasn't deserted or anything. Everybody was just inside, very low to minimal traffic, when I got this feeling of being followed. My first fear and thought was actually being mugged, but as I turned to look, it was this shape following me, hiding behind trees, and coming after me through the bushes and anything that it could hide behind. But it was gaining speed, and there were points where I could clearly see the shape and distinctive head of what had been reoccurring through my nightmares. The same thing I had seen, the same hand I had seen on my glass, and it was getting closer. I began sprinting for my life. At one point or another, I had thought about deviating it away from my home, but then I realized it clearly knows where I live, and it would be best and much safer to actually make it home, alive, in one piece. I made it home, and I told my father what had happened. He knew there wasn't much the police were going to do. He just forbid me from going out after dark anymore. This entire time, I had been still having these reoccurring nightmares. Not as bad or as often as the summertime, but still very often and frequent. Even more horrifying than the ones in the summertime. I mean, the feelings and emotions were more intense. That walk home was probably the last time I would actually physically see it until my senior year. Until then, all throughout the rest of my sophomore and even into my junior year and throughout the rest of my junior year, I would just see it out of the corner of my eye, see it approaching my house at nighttime, the same old terror as before, even having the constant nightmares. Everything was the same. And then, when I began my senior year, everything intensified. The dreams, the coming up to the house at night, tapping on my window, everything crescendoed up to one night when I was a senior in high school, near graduation, actually. I was lying in bed, and something woke me up out of a sleep. It wasn't the tapping sound, or the scratching, or the horrible feelings of this thing being around the house. I woke up to the sensation that something was in the room with me, and I could feel an evil presence. I immediately opened my eyes, and I just instinctively knew that this thing had somehow found a way in the house and was now in the room with me. As my brain was finishing and processing this very thought, this heavy, raspy breathing began to kick in, and I could hear the weight beneath it on my floorboards creak as it slowly approached my bed. I was frozen in pure fear. I could not move. I lay there, almost sobbing, and it almost nearly got to my bed. And then nothing. It just completely vanished, along with the feelings, everything. It's like the room and the air instantly went still. I sat there for a couple more moments, terrified and completely confused. So I turned around quickly, flicked the light on. Nothing was there. The room and everything else felt completely fine. So I sat up, wondered what had just happened. Well, I tried to get some sleep, even though that was easier said than done. So the night goes on, and the very next morning, I got some very disturbing news. Remember that friend I told you about? The one whose great aunt had passed, and him and I did the seance that started this whole thing. Well, him and a couple other friends of mine at his house. He had committed suicide last night, right in the early morning hours. I was shocked and deeply saddened, but since sophomore year, him and I's friendship had pretty much completely dissipated. He went on one path, I went on the other, and he was a very troubled young man. Lots of addiction issues, we'll say, and just a lot of home issues. So now, as I'm older, I don't know if his sudden suicide and this thing stalking me, haunting my life, have any direct connection with each other. Because as soon as that happened, as soon as he committed suicide, that was the last I ever saw or felt of this thing. It's like it just suddenly vanished out of my life. I never felt the horrible feelings of it being outside my window, or heard the tapping, or saw it. It was nothing but peace. I don't really understand the reasoning for that. So the only thing I can possibly theorize is that this thing was somehow attached to him while he was alive, and for whatever reason, attached itself to me. But what I don't understand is why it suddenly vanished once he passed, assuming there is a connection between the two. But I don't know how else to explain my weird series of events. Anyhow, that's my own personal horror story, and my run-in with what I personally believe was a Wendigo demon spirit, or whatever you want to call it. I haven't seen or encountered anything paranormal, weird, uncomfortable, or strange since then, which I'm very thankful to report. Feel free to use this story in any way. Hopefully, you sharing this story will help somebody else out there. My grandfather was not a good man around this time of his story. He was really what you would call a disappointment. My mother even tells me, back when he was in his prime, he was hanging out at the Rez's skate park with some friends, and just overall, having the time of his life. They were drinking and trying new things, just teens being teens. It's said that they saw a figure walking in the woods. They began to harass and yell, thinking it was a person. It gets fuzzy here, but he said that it began to chase them, maybe 500 feet where they ended up behind the school in a little shed, closed the door and hid. I guess it saw them and ended up knocking around the shed and wouldn't leave. He and his friends hid from whatever it was till morning. Prior to when I was born, my mom was in a similar mental situation as my grandfather. This one is shorter. The story goes, my mother and aunt were hanging out in an empty house, drinking, and doing other things that teens do. Chillin'. And then they hear a very loud cackle, like laugh. They stopped everything, and waited to see if somebody would come out. My aunt, being who she is, laughed, and once again it started up. My mother had freaked out and begged her to stop. Just then, a beer bottle flew past my aunt's head, busted in the back wall. I don't recall what she did after, but I'm assuming they ran. When my uncle was around 2 or 3, he had gone missing for a few hours, and they ended up finding him where the res meets the forest. They asked him what happened, and he just said, "I was playing with the little people." The little people are a legend of a lot of tribes, but have represented differently. My people portray them as tricksters, who also sometimes mean bad luck, or even death. Again, these stories are passed down to me by my elders and mom. My writing isn't the best. I still ain't got the point of posting. However, I hope you were able to understand at least some of this. Thank you. So, as a preface to this story, I was driving on the State Road 54, a road in Florida that goes all throughout the state, and for the most part, used to be all woods. It was 3:45 a.m., and I was driving to my friend's house, who lives just 45 minutes away, to carpool to our job in a city about an hour and a half away from where he lived. I was leaving the city that I lived in and was driving through more heavily wooded areas at a red light. As I was waiting for the light to turn green, I saw the glow of 2 bright orange eyes. The woods were approximately 25 feet from the main road. The eyes got closer, like it hadn't seen me, and it looked around 6 to 7 feet tall. Thin, quite thin. It was too dark to see any features, but when our eyes connected, the thing bolted into the woods. It just didn't look human, frankly, and at this point, I thought it might be a bear or something, as it was standing on its 2 back legs. And I mean, that son of a gun was quick for its size. I have no idea what I saw, but the profile seems to look like a skinwalker or a wendigo. I have no idea. Any possible help or info to explain what I saw would greatly be appreciated. This story is from my mother, her friend, and her friend's daughter. They also experienced this. I was asleep at the time. My family has a caravan, or trailer, for those in the USA, that we go and stay in for the holidays. It's up in the Victorian High Country, here in Australia. It's pretty remote, with some small towns and farms. One night, at 3 a.m., my mother had gone out to the communal bathroom block. Her friend and friend's daughter were also awake. While mother was in the bathrooms, she heard what she described to me as the most horrible, inhuman growl, scream, echoing all throughout the valley. It was nothing that she had ever heard before. Not any of the common animal sounds she had heard there either, like deer calls, possums, bulls from nearby farms. She said that she was terrified. My mother's friend and her daughter had heard it too. They thought my mother was going to be murdered or something. Even our dog was barking. Mother came back safe, and they all spoke about how they had heard it. Somehow I slept through it all. I was only 11 at the time. I've always been curious. I want to know what it sounds like, and what it was, although my mother tells me to this day that I should not want to know. Whenever I'm there, awake at night, it's quiet. I listen. I've been told that my situation might be a skinwalker. I don't know if that is true, so I'm here where others know more than I do. I don't know if this has any bearing on anything, but my ancestry is Native American and Irish, with a touch of Scottish. My father was Native, his father Cherokee, and mother Mattapony. My mother was a Lynch from the Lynch clan, with a Scottish ancestor back in there too. I will try and make this short, and can fill in anything if somebody wants more information. This pretty much started in the 2000s, with some weird events. We had all kinds of, paranormal things happen. Typical experiences like objects moving, etc. It was me and my 3 children. Then, I picked up a stalker who would come to the house, dressed in all black. He would be wearing a black motorcycle helmet, would be looking in windows day or night. Sometimes he drove a black vehicle, still wore his helmet. No plates on either. My neighbor chased him off a few times, and if I saw him by the time I could get outside, he would usually be driving away. I came home a few times to weird things like every bowl or spoon in the house missing, all appliances on and plugged in, but all doors and windows closed and locked. Police did not believe me. At the same time, we were experiencing a lot of paranormal activity. Disembodied voices, seeing people walk across the room, doors opening and closing, cabinets, shower curtain being jerked open when the shower, and nothing there. We did not tell the police about those events. Then, one night, my girls, about 10 and 12 at the time, woke me up screaming that there was a man at the window. I went to the room. The blind was down, and I thought they had a nightmare because of what was going on. I pulled the blind up, and there was a man standing there. I did not get a good look, but he had to be very tall to look in the window, so I dropped the blind and called the police. We went downstairs to the family room and waited. There was a door in the converted basement, and the knob kept jiggling, like somebody trying to get in. We sat in horror for 3 hours before the police finally showed up. Outside, the girls' window, they found a blue piece of construction paper with a circle and 3 smaller ovals created out of a cornmeal-like paste. They figured it meant that me and 3 children. They did not believe me about any of it because it just snowed and there were no footprints. Not long after this, I became ill and was later on diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, fibromyalgia, and myofascial pain syndrome. The harassment continued as well, and all the paranormal activity. I don't know what else to call it. Fast forward a few years, my children grew up and moved away, and I remarried. Moved about 5 minutes away. In the beginning, not much happened. I actually felt great, physically and mentally. And then it all started again. We saw people sneaking around, windows and doors, weird things occurring on the inside of the house, paranormal type things. We have seen orbs come in one bedroom while we lay there awake, pause, and go out the other window. And during all this, my health went downhill again. This is over the last 8 years. What is the weirdest is a few times a year we hear a howl, almost like a wolf right outside. I lived in the Montana wilderness for a short while when I was in my early 20s. I have had plenty of wolf encounters. It sounds similar to a wolf, but it is louder, longer, not as guttural, I think. It is always right in the middle of the night, no specific time. It has happened at 8 p.m. as well, and woke us up. Definitely not a dog. Our dogs and cats freak out as well as the neighborhood dogs when it happens too. Then, the smell the next day is like a skunk outside but earthier. Not as rancid, if that makes sense. But it is not a pleasant smell at all. So, I just wanted to stop and have a nice, comfortable, normal life as much as that possible. Someone said this might be a skinwalker. I personally have not done anything that I know of, but maybe my parents did. I say this because my mother once told me a story after I was born. They moved down to Mississippi, where my dad was from, a very small town. The house they were to rent was not ready, so they were allowed to stay in the schoolhouse. This was a very rural area. My uncle, Dad's brother, was with them, and he was going to stay with them. I don't know if it was the first night or what, but one night, they awoke to the chanting of "Bring us the baby." They looked out, saw white figures moving in and out of view, all chanting they wanted the baby. My uncle thought it was the KKK, because they were native, and went out and told them to leave and shot at them. He kept shooting, but hit nothing, and told my mother they had no legs that he could see. He went back in, and they barricaded the door. This was long before cell phones, so they couldn't call anybody, and there was no phone in the school. They sat there, backs against, over desks, as it went on until daybreak. My uncle left then, and did not hear from him for 3 years. My dad would tell me he's not going to talk about it, and if you asked my uncle, he would leave. My mother only spoke of it one time, and refused after that. I'm not saying I'm special in any way, shape, or form, but could all this be connected? Can a deal be made and then I and my children go through this because it was not completed? I'm tired. I am to the point to where I look at my husband and say, "Oh look, the comb is moving across the sink by itself again." Just stupid things. I'm working from home now, and it is non-stop wearing on me. We just heard the howl recently, and had the smell after that. We lost our refrigerator, garage door opener, dryer, and my laptop. To give a better idea of how things are, back in the beginning of November, I was reading on my Kindle on the couch. My husband was at his desk behind the couch area. My desk was in front of me to the left of the fireplace. It was about 8:30 at night. A white weasel ran up the left side of my desk, ran across my desk, a big old metal tanker desk, and jumped down the right side by the fireplace, and just disappeared. My dog on my lap saw it, and a Siamese and Maine Coon saw it, all went over to investigate. They were all fluffed up, looked really disturbed, and checked out the desk area for about an hour. The dog hid initially after checking it out. He's not very brave. I was told the white weasel was a bad sign, but really gave no more thought to it. But a week later, my father passed away. He was in good health, so it was sudden and a shock. We have cameras inside and out, and the great room cam froze when this happened. I rarely get things because the cameras want to freeze up and have to be restarted. I do have one night where we caught orbs doing weird things in the same room, recorded on a motion-activated camera. Anyway, I'm sorry for this being so long. I don't know if any of this is related. All I can say at this point is I'm beyond frustrated. I have always had a very deep respect for native spirituality, and in all of my learning about different traditions and important figures, I never thought I could ever come into contact with a piece of it. I didn't even think that it was a possibility that these animals were shapeshifters of any sort, until very recently I was telling my brother about it, and he told me that it might be. I grew up in the central mountains of Idaho, in between several big mining towns from the late 1800s, and living here for most of my life. I know what the wildlife looks like, and I know what I would see in which time of year, except for a few encounters that I still can't complain. I was out early with my dad and my grandfather to go and find a scrap pile to get some firewood from. It was about 7 or 8 in the morning, and we're on a tiny dirt path, miles away from any house. As we're driving, we turn a corner to see an animal sitting in the middle of the road. I would say that it was the size of about a large dog, but hunched close to the ground, completely black. It had a long tail that dragged on the ground. Then we pulled up, and it turned to look at us and had a small head, with either small ears or no ears. I couldn't see anything specific. After it saw us, it hopped off the trail into the bushes on the side of the road. Believe me when I tell you this, I have never in my life seen an animal that looked like this. We were all confused. One other time, I was out riding my ATV at around sunset. I was by myself on some trails that I knew well. I decided to start exploring a bit and took a different path. Suddenly, it started to go up a steep hill with lots of washout. As I stopped to try and turn around, the scariest looking bird I have ever seen ran in front of me across the trail. There are a lot of wild chickens, turkeys, etc. But this was about the size of a chicken, but it almost appeared as if the body was backwards, or if it was standing straight up, looking very skinny, just not like a bird. I could not see any visible wings, but it did have a longer neck, and its head was bare, like a turkey, or a vulture's might be. I finished turning around and sped back home. I don't know much of the native tribes that would have inhabited this area long before the gold rush, but I do know that a lot of violence and death happened because of it, with the historical cemetery having well over 100 unmarked graves. If anyone might be able to confirm or deny my theory, I would really appreciate that. So this day started out with a phone call from my brother, who was asking to take a hike in the national forest outside of our town, and then to go spend the night out there, in hopes of doing a little fishing and roasting some marshmallows over a fire. It was me, my brother, his girlfriend, who I see as my loving little sister, so it was going to be a really nice night. We left town, headed to the woods pretty early that day, around 3 in the afternoon. We had gotten to our spot in the woods after 2 hours of riding around, trying to find the perfect spot to set up our tent. My brother, sister, and I decided to start the day with some fishing. We grabbed our rods and tackle box, headed for a little stream about a quarter mile from our spot. As we came close to the stream, we noticed this awful smell, kind of like rotting meat. When we came up to the river, we found the source of the smell, an abundance of dead fish, all around the edge of the stream, and had seen the water that had a nasty rust-colored tint to it. When we were done gagging at the sight and smell of what was in front of us, a huge sense of dread washed over with an uncomfortable feeling of being watched. My sister noticed, asked what was wrong. I played it off with a joke, suggesting we go make a fire and setting up tent. I shrugged it off, really not wanting to frighten her or anybody else. After another 30-minute hike from the stream back to the campground, my brother and sister began collecting wood for the fire, while I began to set up the tent. I set the tent up around the same time they came back with enough wood to have a fire last quite a long while. We got the fire lit. I admit, it was a pretty darn good fire. We then decided to roast marshmallows. Before I could eat any, I had to take a leak. So I told them I was going to step into the woods for just a second to go pee. I walk about 30 feet in and began to relieve myself when I heard my sister say hello. Finding this extremely odd, I looked around and didn't see anything or anyone. So, naturally, I go back to do my business. As I was zipping up my zipper, I heard her say it again. Hey. Thinking they were pranking me, I rushed back to the campground to find them still roasting marshmallows over the fire. I kind of freaked out. I'd asked them if they were messing with me, to which they frowned, explained that they've been in the same spot since I went to the woods. Now I'm terrified. They saw how ghost white I was, and asked me if everything was all right. I told them what I'd heard. They suggested we just go into the tent and go to bed early, so that's what we did. After already taking a while to fall asleep, I woke up in the middle of the night to some underbrush crunching just right outside our tent. and that horrible smell from earlier was back. Worse than before. For fear of scaring the hell out of my brother and sister, I decided to not wake them up. As I sat there, shaking and sweating, I noticed the sound of twigs snapping, and it had stopped. I began to hear what I could swear was loud, raspy, heavy breathing, like something was trying to sniff out our tent. I quietly tried to lay back down, cover my ears so I couldn't hear the breathing anymore, and eventually, I fell back asleep. The next morning we woke up late, so we decided to start packing up our belongings and head home. When we got out of the tent, the first thing we noticed was our cooler was torn up and down, thrown upside down against a tree, with everything in it was strewn throughout the campsite. Another thing I noticed was when I was rolling the tent up, a ton of footprints, weird footprints, that looked almost like normal, except for obvious claw marks above each toe. Once I spotted these, I hurried up, putting the tent in my truck, and got my brother, sister, and myself out of there as quick and safely as I could. As of yet, I haven't been back camping in any kind of woods, and I can't imagine coming across another one of these things. The following experience happened just a few years ago. The person I was dating at the time was Native and invited me to go with them to their grandmother's house for Christmas. This being the first time I've ever been to a Native American reservation, I wasn't sure what to expect. I had a lot of ideas regarding what might be, as well as the what-ifs. Nevertheless, excited to go somewhere I had never been before. Most of my excitement was reserved towards learning more about the culture and the unique opportunity of visiting a reservation as an outsider. Because of this, I was also a bit nervous. What if I wasn't accepted? Would the people be welcoming, or would they be hostile towards my presence? Although these questions were lingering, most of my fears were quelled by the wonderful hospitality that I had been shown by both Grandma and the people I had the privilege to interact with, all while visiting. We left our house on Christmas Eve with our dog and began to make the journey, a 4-hour journey to Grandma's house. On the way, we saw a beautiful sunset scatter across the mountains. After traveling for about 3 hours, we find ourselves at the turnoff that leads to an hour-long drive on a desolate road that would eventually take us to our destination. While on this road, my significant other shared stories of dances and the polytheistic practices their tribe had. All of it fascinated me and left me asking more and more questions than I had ever imagined asking. And by the time we arrive at Grandma's house, it's dark and cold. As I begin to unpack the car, my significant other takes our dog a bit away from the house to go potty. By the time they get back, I have taken our bags inside, locked the car up for the night. We sit around the kitchen table, eating food, amazing food cooked by Grandma. We share stories and play a card game. After about an hour, we all say goodnight and get ready to turn in for bed. It's now 12 a.m. My significant other and I lay down, and I call our dog to the bed. A short time thereafter, we fall asleep, although I had forgotten to turn off the light next to the bed on the nightstand. Around 2, maybe 3 a.m., I woke up, having to use the restroom, and noticed that our dog was sitting, just looking at the door that led out to the small hallway. On the other side was the main door to the house. I called for her to come back to the bed. She was just putting her nose at the base of the bedroom, sniffing while scratching. Thinking that she too had to use the restroom, I walked up to the main house door, opened it, ushering her to go potty. She ended up just sitting there and staring. After trying to get her to go outside a few times, failing in my attempts, I closed the door made my way to the kitchen to grab a glass of water. In the kitchen, there's a big window to the very right of the sink. That window overlooks the driveway to the house with a bit of light. It makes the driveway just barely visible at nighttime. As I reach to turn on the faucet, my head turns to the right to look outside. I see a dog sitting outside, staring into the house. Something was off about this dog. It was much larger than a typical large breed by 2 times. I began to get the chills, and internally said to myself, "Screw this." Grabbing my water, about to head back to bed, the dog gets up and begins to walk away. One thing that I might feel not to convey well is the way this dog walked. It seemed to walk very awkwardly and almost stiff. After making my way back to bed, falling asleep and waking up the next morning, while eating the breakfast that Grandma had made, I just nonchalantly asked to anyone listening at the table if the neighbors had an extra large dog. That's when Grandma began to ask questions, and my significant other began to look very concerned. Grandma immediately made a few phone calls, and after a bit of time had passed, a native priest and healer arrived at the house. They began to converse silently with Grandma. Thinking I must have done something wrong, my significant other joins my grandma in conversation. They all begin to look at me, talk more, and then the priest goes around the house with sage and cedar. The healer comes to talk with me and Grandma about my experience. My significant other disappears outside the house to gather raw meat. From what I can gather, I encountered something I should not have the previous night, and by my arrival, or an outsider, they had to make certain preparations to ensure our safety for the duration of my stay. After this visit, we visited many other times. I had no other weird experiences, but this particular experience left me chilled to the bone, and I'll live with it the rest of my life. I just can't get over how this dog behaved and how large it was. It all was just so strange.